I neither expect nor want credit for the more extraordinary, and yet more familiar, story that I am about to tell. As it is a case in which my senses refuse to accept their own testimony, I would really be mad if I thought so. However, I am not crazy, and I certainly do not dream. But tomorrow I may die, and I would like to lighten my spirit today. My immediate desire is to show the world, clearly, concretely, and without comment, a series of simple domestic events that, due to their consequences, have terrified, tortured, and stunned me. Despite everything, I will not try to clarify them. They have produced almost no other feeling in me than that of horror, but to many people they will seem less terrible than Baroque. Perhaps later there will be an intelligence that will reduce my ghost to the status of commonplace. Some intelligence more serene, more logical, and much less excitable than mine, will only find in the circumstances that I recount with terror a normal series of causes and effects that are most natural. The docility and humanity of my character surprised from my childhood. So remarkable was the tenderness of my heart that it had made me the toy of my friends. I had a real passion for animals, and my parents allowed me to own a wide variety of favorites. Most of my time was spent with them, and I never considered myself so happy as when I was feeding or petting them. With the years this peculiarity of my character increased, and when I was a man I made it one of my main sources of joy. Those who have professed affection to a faithful and shrewd dog require no explanation of the nature or intensity of the joys that may be produced. In the disinterested love of an animal, in self-sacrifice, there is something that goes straight to the heart of one who has often had the opportunity to experience the petty friendship and fragile fidelity of natural man. I married young. I was lucky to discover in my wife a disposition similar to mine. Noticing my taste for these domestic favorites, he lost no opportunity of furnishing me with them of the most congenial kind. We had birds, a gold-colored fish, a magnificent dog, rabbits, a little monkey, and a cat. This last animal was very strong and beautiful, completely black and of wonderful sagacity. My wife, who was, at heart, somewhat superstitious, speaking of her intelligence, frequently alluded to the old popular belief that all black cats were disguised witches. This does not mean that he was always serious about this matter, and I mention it simply because I remember it. Pluto, that was the name of the cat, was my favorite friend. I alone fed him, and wherever I went he followed me around the house. I even had a hard time stopping him from following me down the street. Our friendship thus subsisted for some years, during which my character and temperament, I am ashamed to admit it, because of the demon of intemperance, underwent a radically fatal alteration. From day to day I became more taciturn, more irritable, more indifferent to the feelings of others. I used brutal language with my wife, and over time I even afflicted her with personal violence. Naturally, my poor favorite must have noticed the change in my character. Not only did he ignore them, but he mistreated them. As for Pluto, however, he still aroused enough consideration in me not to hit him. On the other hand, I felt no qualms about mistreating the rabbits, the monkey, and even the dog, when, by chance or out of affection, they crossed my path. But my evil was kidnapping me, because, what evil admits a comparison with alcohol? As time went by, Pluto himself, who grew older and naturally became a bit sullen, began to experience the effects of my perverse character. One night, on the occasion of returning home completely drunk, from one of my frequent hiding places in the neighborhood, it seemed to me that the cat avoided my presence. I took it, but he, horrified by my violent attitude, made a slight wound in my hand, with his teeth. A demonic rage seized me suddenly. At that moment I stopped knowing myself. It seemed as if my original soul had suddenly left my body, and a superdemonic, gin-saturated nastiness seeped into every fiber of my being. From my waistcoat pocket I took a penknife, opened it, seized the poor animal by the throat and deliberately gouged out one eye. I blush, it burns me, I shudder as I write this abominable atrocity. When, at dawn, I had recovered my reason, when the vapors of my nocturnal debauchery had dissipated, I experienced a feeling half horror, half remorse, for the crime I had committed. But, at the most, it was a weak and equivocal feeling, and the soul did not suffer its assaults. I plunged into excess again, and soon drowned in wine all memory of my action. In the meantime, the cat healed slowly. The orbit of the missing eye presented, it is true, a frightful aspect. But then, over time, he didn't seem to notice it. As was his custom, he went to and fro in the house, but, as I should have supposed, as soon as he saw me approaching him, he fled in terror. I still had enough of my old heart to afflict me with that manifest antipathy in a creature who had loved me so much before. But this feeling was soon dislodged by irritation. As if from my final and irrevocable fall, the spirit of perversity sprung up, a spirit of which philosophy cares neither little nor much. However, as sure as my soul exists, I believe that perversity is one of the primitive impulses of the human heart, one of those indivisible first faculties or feelings that direct the character of man. Who has not been surprised many times committing a mistake, foolish or vile action, for the sole reason that he knew better than to do it? Have we not a constant inclination, however excellent our judgment, to break what is the law, simply because we understand that it is the law? I say that this spirit of perversity had to produce my complete ruin. The live and unfathomable desire of the soul to torment itself, to do violence to its own nature, to do evil for the love of evil, impelled me to continue and ultimately to carry out the torture that I had inflicted on the harmless animal. One morning, in cold blood, I tied a noose around his neck and hung him from a tree branch. I hung him with tears in my eyes, my heart overflowing with the bitterest remorse. I hanged him because I knew that he had loved me, and because I recognized that he had given me no reason to be angry with him. I hanged him because I knew that in doing so I was committing a sin, a mortal sin that compromised my immortal soul, to the point of placing it, if that were possible, far from even the infinite mercy of the most terrible and merciful God. In the night following the day on which such a cruel act was committed, I was awakened from sleep by the cry of fire. The curtains of my bed were on fire. The house was blazing. It was not without great difficulty that my wife, a servant, and I managed to escape from the fire. The destruction was total. I was ruined, and have given myself over to despair ever since. I am not trying to establish any relationship between cause and effect with respect to the atrocity and the disaster. I am above such weakness. But I am limiting myself to giving an account of a chain of facts, and I do not want to omit the smallest link. I visited the ruins the day after the fire. Except one, all the walls had collapsed. This sole exception was a thin interior partition, situated almost in the middle of the house, against which the head of my bed leaned. There the factory had largely resisted the action of the fire, a fact that I attributed to having been recently renovated. Around that wall the crowd was gathering, and numerous people were examining a part of the wall with lively and minute attention. The words strange, singular, and other similar expressions excited my curiosity. I approached and saw, like a bas-relief carved on the white surface, the figure of a gigantic cat. The image was given with an accuracy truly marvelous. Around the animal's neck rope. As soon as I had seen this apparition, because I could not consider it more than an apparition, my astonishment and my terror were extraordinary. At last reflection came to my aid. He remembered that the cat had been hanged in a garden next to the house. At the cries of alarm, the garden was immediately invaded by the mob, and the animal must have been lowered by someone from the tree and thrown into my room through an open window. Undoubtedly it was done to wake up me. The collapse of the remaining walls had compressed the victim of my cruelty in the recently spread plaster. The whitewash from the wall, in combination with the flames and ammonia from the corpse, produced the image as I saw it. Although I thus quickly satisfied my reason, if not completely my conscience, it did not fail, however, to leave a deep imprint on my imagination the surprising case that I have just reported. For some months I could not get rid of the ghost of the cat, and during all this time a kind of feeling arose in my soul that resembled, although it was not, remorse. I even went so far as to lament the loss of the animal and to look around me, in the miserable slums that I then frequented, for another favorite of the same species and of similar features who could replace it. I was sitting one night, half dazed, in an infamous tavern, when my attention was suddenly drawn to a black object lying on top of one of the immense gin or rum barrels that made up the most important furniture in the room. I had been looking at the top of the barrel for some moments, and was surprised that I had not noticed the object placed on top. I went up to him and touched him. It was a huge black cat, as big as Pluto, which it resembled in all but one detail. Pluto did not have a single white hair on its entire body, but it had a broad white mark, albeit indefinitely, which gave it covered almost the entire chest region. As soon as I put my hand on it, it suddenly rose up, purring loudly, rubbed against my hand, and seemed pleased with my attention. It was so, the animal I was looking for. I hastened to propose to the owner its acquisition, but he had no interest in the animal. I neither knew nor had seen him until then. I continued stroking it, and when I was about to return home, the animal was willing to follow me. I let him, and leaning from time to time, we walked towards my house caressing him. When I get to her she found herself as her own, and quickly became my wife's best friend. For my part, it did not take long for me to develop an antipathy towards him. It was, then, precisely the opposite of what I had expected. I don't know how or why this happened, but his obvious tenderness made me angry and almost exhausted. Little by little, these feelings of disgust and annoyance grew until they became the bitterness of hatred. I avoided his presence. A kind of shame, and the memory of my first cruelty, prevented me from mistreating him. For some weeks I refrained from hitting him or treating him violently, but gradually, imperceptibly, I came to feel for him an unspeakable horror, and to evade in silence, as if fleeing from the plague, his hateful presence. Undoubtedly, what increased my hatred for the animal was the discovery I made the morning of the day after I brought it home. Like Pluto, he too had been deprived of one of his eyes. However, this circumstance contributed to make my wife more agreeable, who, as I have already said, greatly possessed the tenderness of feelings that was once my characteristic feature and the frequent source of my simplest and purest pleasures. However, the affection that the cat showed me seemed to grow in direct proportion to my hatred of him. With a tenacity impossible to make the reader understand, he constantly followed my steps. As soon as I sat down, she would curl up under my chair, or jump on my knees, covering me with her hideous caresses. If I got up to walk, it would get between my legs and almost knock me over, or, digging its long, sharp claws into my clothes, it would climb up them to my chest. At those moments, even though I would have wanted to kill him with a blow, the memory of my first crime prevented me in part, but above all, I hasten to confess, the true terror of the animal. This terror was not positively that of physical illness, and yet it would be very difficult for me to define it otherwise. I'm almost ashamed to admit it. Even in this criminal's cell, I am almost ashamed to admit that my horror and panic about the animal had been increased by one of the most perfect fantasies that it is possible to imagine. My wife, not infrequently, had called my attention to the character of the white spot of which I have spoken and which constituted the only perceptible difference between the strange animal and the one that I had killed. The reader will doubtless remember that this sign, though large, originally had an indefinite form. But slowly, gradually, by imperceptible phases and which my reason strove for a long time to consider as imaginary, it had ended up acquiring a rigorous sharpness of contours. At that time it was the image of an object that makes me shudder to name it. It was, above all, what made me look at him like a monster of horror and disgust, and what, if I had dared, would have impelled me to get rid of him. It was now, I say, the image of an abominable and sinister thing, the image of the gallows. O lugubrious and terrible machine, machine of terror and crime, of death and agony. I was then, in truth, a wretch, beyond the possible wretchedness of humanity. A brute beast, whose brother was annihilated by me with contempt, a brute beast engendered in me, a man formed in the image of the Most High, such great and intolerable misfortune. Oh! Neither by day nor by night did I know the peace of rest. Not for a single moment during the day did the animal leave me. And at night, every moment, when I came out of my dreams full of indefinable anguish, it was only to feel the warm breath of the thing on my face and its enormous weight, incarnation of a nightmare that I could not separate from myself and that seemed eternally perched on my heart. Under such torments what little was good in me succumbed. Infamous thoughts became my intimate, the darkest, the most infamous of all thoughts. The sadness of my habitual mood increased to make me hate all things and all humanity. My wife, however, never complained. Oh! It was my cloth tears forever. The most patient victim of the sudden, frequent and indomitable expansions of a fury to which I have certainly given myself ever since. For a domestic chore, he accompanied me one day to the basement of an old building in which he forced us to live our poverty. Up the sharp steps of the ladder the cat followed me, and, having tripped my head, exasperated me to madness. Seizing an axe and forgetting in my fury the childish fright that had hitherto held my hand, I aimed a blow at the animal, which would have been fatal if I had hit it as I wanted. But my wife's hand stopped the blow. A diabolical rage that gave me this intervention. I freed my arm from the obstacle that held it back and plunged the axe into her skull. My wife fell dead instantly, without so much as a moan. The horrible murder having been accomplished, I immediately and resolutely endeavored to hide the body. I realized that I couldn't make him disappear from the house, day or night, without the risk of the neighbors finding out. They assailed my mind several projects. I thought for a moment about breaking up the corpse and throwing the pieces on the ground. I resolved afterwards to dig a pit in the floor of the cave. Then I thought, well, throw it into the garden. They changed their minds and I decided to pack it in a box, like a piece of merchandise, in the usual way, and to order an errand boy to take it from home. But, finally, I stopped before a project that I considered the most feasible. I decided to wall it up in the cellar, as monks are said to have done with their victims in the Middle Ages. The cave seemed to have been built on purpose for such a project. The walls were not raised with the usual care and not long ago had been covered in its entirety by a layer of plaster that did not allow the humidity to harden. On the other hand, there was a projection on one of the walls, produced by an artificial fireplace or some kind of fireplace that was later covered and arranged in the same way as the rest of the basement. I did not doubt that it would be easy for me to remove the bricks from that place, place the corpse and wall it up in the same way, so that no glance could discover anything suspicious. I was not fooled by my calculation. Aided by a crowbar, I easily separated the bricks, and, having then carefully pressed the body against the inner wall, held it in this position until I could, without much effort, restore the whole masonry to its primitive state. With all imaginable precautions, I took a mortar of lime and sand, prepared a layer that could not be distinguished from the original one, and scrupulously covered the new partition with it. When I finished, I saw that everything had turned out perfect. The wall did not present the slightest sign of repair. With the greatest care I swept the floor and collected the debris, looked around me triumphantly and said to myself, at least, here, my work has not been fruitless. My first idea, then, was to look for the animal that was the cause of such tremendous misfortune, because, finally, I had decided to kill it. If she had been able to find him at that moment, nothing would have prevented her fate. But it seemed that the artificial animal, faced with the violence of my anger, had become alarmed and tried not to appear before me, defying my bad humor. Impossible to describe or imagine the intense, peaceful sense of relief that the absence of the detestable creature brought to my heart. He appeared throughout the night, and this was the first time I had enjoyed since his arrival in the house, sleeping peacefully and soundly. Yes, I slept with the weight of that murder on my soul. They passed the second and third day. My executioner did not come, however. Like a free man, I breathed once more. In its terror, the monster had left those places forever. I would never see him again. My happiness was infinite. The criminality of my dark action troubled me very little. A kind of summary was started that did little to speed up the investigations. A reconnaissance was also arranged, but of course nothing could be discovered. I took my future happiness for granted. On the fourth day after the murder was committed, a group of police officers unexpectedly showed up at my house and again proceeded to a rigorous investigation of the premises. However, confident in the impenetrability of the hiding place, I did not experience any disturbance. The agents wanted him to accompany them in their investigations. It was explored every nook and cranny. For the third or fourth time they finally went down to the cave. Do not disturb me in the slightest. Like that of a man resting in innocence, my heart beat peacefully. I walked from end to end of the basement, crossing my arms over my chest and pacing nonchalantly from one side to the other. Fully satisfied, the police were preparing to leave the house. The joy in my heart was too great for me to suppress it. He felt the urge to say a word only by way of triumph, and make his conviction of my innocence doubly evident. Gentlemen, I said finally, as the agents went up the stairs, it gives me great satisfaction that your suspicions will have been dispelled. I wish all of you good health and a little more courtesy. By the way, gentlemen, you have a house built here. I hardly knew what I was talking about, in my furious desire to say something deliberately. I can assure you that this is a superbly built home. These walls. Are you leaving, gentlemen? These walls are built with great solidity. Then, by a frantic bluff, I struck hard, with a cane that I was holding in my hand at the time, precisely on the partition wall behind which lay the wife of my heart. Oh! May God at least protect me and free me from the clutches of the archdemon. As soon as the echo of my blows had sunk into silence, a voice answered me from the bottom of the tomb. It was first a complaint, veiled and found like the sob of a child. Then, at once, it swelled into a long, sonorous, and continuous, utterly abnormal and inhuman, scream, howl, half horror, half triumph, such as can only come from hell, horrible harmony that issued in unison from the throats of the condemned in their tortures and the demons who enjoyed their condemnation. It would be madness to express my feelings. I felt faint and, staggering, fell against the opposite wall. For an instant they stopped at the steps the agents. Terror and of awe. A moment later, 12 stout arms attacked the wall, sending it crashing to the ground. The corpse, already badly disfigured and covered in clotted blood, appeared rigid to the eyes of those around it. Upon his head, with red jaws gaping and one eye blazing, perched the hateful animal whose cunning led me to murder and whose revealing voice delivered me to the executioner. I had walled the monster in the tomb.